Chapter number 7 of The Life of Captain James Cook, the Circumnavigator, by Arthur Kitson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter number 7, 1768 to 1769. Plymouth to Otahelte. After waiting for some days for a fair wind, Cook eventually sailed at 2 p.m. on the 26th of August, having, as he says in his journal, 94 persons, including officers, seamen, gentlemen and their servants, near 18 months' provisions, 10 carriage guns, 12 swivels, with good store of ammunition, and stores of all kinds on board. On the 1st of September they had heavy gales lasting for about 24 hours, and a small boat belonging to the boatswain was washed away, and between 3 and 4 dozen of our poultry, which was worst of all, were drowned. The ship was found to be very leaky in her upper works, and the sails in the store got very wet. Banks notes that they caught 2 birds in the rigging that had evidently been blown off course from Spain. On the 13th of September they anchored in Funchal Roads, and during the night the bend of the hawser of the stream anchor slipped owing to the carelessness of the person who made it fast. The anchor was hauled up into a boat in the morning and carried further out, but unfortunately in heaving it into the water a master's mate named Weir got entangled in the buoy rope, was carried overboard, and drowned before any assistance could be rendered. Whilst shifting her berth to a more convenient spot, the Endeavour was fired on by one of the forts owing to some misunderstanding, but satisfactory apologies and explanations were made, and it was thought so little of that neither Cook nor Banks mentioned it in their journals. This incident is probably the origin of the story told by Forster in his journal of the second voyage. He says, Captain Cook in the Endeavour battered the Loo fort at Madeira in conjunction with the English frigate, thus resenting an affront which had been offered to the British flag. When the Endeavour arrived at Funchal, the only British man of war there was HMS Rose, which sailed the following day with her convoy, and neither her captain's journal nor his ship's log make any reference whatever to a dispute with the Portuguese. No other British man of war came into the port whilst the Endeavour was there, and afterwards at Rio Cook expressly informed the Viceroy that he had been well received by the Portuguese at Madeira. Fresh water, meat, vegetables and wine were taken on board, wine, fruit and water being good and cheap, but the meat and poultry, obtained as a favour, were dear. 2 men, a marine and a sailor, received 12 lashes for refusing to eat their allowance of fresh meat. This appears to be harsh treatment, but it must be remembered that the lash was at that time almost the only recognised method of punishment in the Navy, however trivial the offence might be, and Cook knew from experience how important it was to prevent the scurvy from getting foothold on board, and he already had determined to fight by every means in his power this dread scourge, almost his most dangerous foe. He did conquer it even on this first voyage, and considering his means, in a most marvellous manner. He would have claimed the victory had it not been for an untoward event, which will be told hereafter, leading him to postpone his claim till he could give further proof. It is important to notice how on every possible occasion he obtained, wherever he could, some change of diet and fresh water. Eden before the fall. Whilst they were at Funchal, Banks spent 5 days with the English consul, and he describes the place as very pretty, but the people as primitive, idle and uninformed, all their instruments of the rudest make, and he thought that the appliances used in the manufacture of wine must have been similar to those used by Noah, although it is not impossible that he might have used better if he remembered the methods he had seen before the flood. One of the governors left it on record that, so averse from change were the people, he thought it most fortunate the island was not eaten before the fall, as in that case the inhabitants could never have been induced to wear clothes. He explored as much of the island as he could, but says he could never get more than 3 miles away from the town, as his time was so much broken up. The governor visited them on one of the days he says was so wasted, but relates with evident glee how he took his revenge. There was an electrical machine on board, and His Excellency was most curious on the subject. It was sent for and explained to him, and Banks goes on, they gave him as many shocks as he cared for, perhaps more. A visit was paid to a convent, where the nuns, hearing they were distinguished scientists, plied them with all sorts of questions, and for the half hour the visit lasted, their tongues were going all the time at an uncommonly nimble rate. At a monastery they visited they were well received, and the monks, regretting they were then unprepared, invited them to come the next day, and, though it would be a Friday, they would have roast turkey for dinner. On the 19th of September, at midnight, they weighed, sighted Tenerife on the 23rd, and the day following their first flying fish found its way into Mr. Green's cabin. On the 28th they tried steaks for dinner cut from a young shark, which Banks and Solander reported as very good, but the crew refused to taste them. Cape de Verde was seen on the 30th, and about a fortnight afterwards the line was crossed in 29 degrees 24 minutes west longitude, and the following day the event was celebrated. Lieutenant Hicks had crossed before, so a list was given to him of all on board, including the dogs and cats, and all were mustered on deck, those who had already crossed being separated from the others. Anyone who wished could purchase immunity for 4 days' allowance of wine, but the others had to pay the penalty of ducking. Banks compounded for himself and party, and Cook also seems to have got off, but the others were hauled up to the end of the mainyard on a boatswain's chair, and then at the sound of the whistle dropped into the sea, an operation repeated 3 times. Cook says the ceremony was performed to about 20 or 30, to the no small diversion of the rest. Whilst near the equator, great inconvenience was felt from the damp heat. Everything was mouldy or rusty, and several of the crew were on the sick list with a sort of bilious complaint, but it fortunately did not grow into a serious matter. Reception at Rio. They struck soundings on the 6th of November, and on heaving the lead again found a difference of less than a foot in 3 or 4 hours. Land was sighted near Cape Frio, Brazil, in latitude 21 degrees 16 minutes south on the 8th, and they came across a boat manned by 11 blacks who were engaged in catching and salting fish. Banks purchased some fish and was surprised to find they preferred to be paid in English rather than Spanish coin. On the 13th they arrived off Rio de Janeiro, where they were very ungraciously received by the Viceroy. They were not permitted to land except under a guard. Some of the men who had been sent ashore on duty were imprisoned. Mr. Hicks, who had gone to report their arrival and ask for the services of a pilot, was detained for a time, and it was only with difficulty and at an exorbitant rate that they obtained fresh food and water. Consequently little was seen of the place except from the ship, and Cook took all possible observations from thence. and made a sketch map of the harbour, to which he added all the information he was able to pick up from the pilot. Writing to the Royal Society, he says he was quite unable to understand the true reason of his treatment, and contrasts it with that received by a Spanish ship which came in whilst he was there. The Spanish ship willingly undertook to carry to Europe and forward to the Admiralty copies of the correspondence that passed between Cook and the Viceroy, which Cook describes as a paper war between me and His Excellency, wherein I had no other advantage than the racking of his invention to find reasons for treating us in the manner he did, for he never would relax the least from any one point. To every remonstrance the Viceroy pleaded his instructions and the custom of the port. He seems to have been quite unable to grasp the object of the expedition, and Cook says his idea of the transit of Venus was the North Star passing through the South Pole, his own words. The crew were accused of smuggling, and it was repeatedly asserted that the Endeavour was not a king's ship. Parkinson, one of Mr. Banks' staff, says that frequently some of them let themselves down from the cabin window at midnight into a boat, and driving with the tide till they were out of hearing of the guard boat established over them, rowed ashore and made short excursions into the country, though not so far as we should have wished to have done. Banks, speaking of the supplies obtained at Rio, says the beef was cheap but very lean and dry. The bread tasted as if made with sawdust, and justified its name of farina de pao, wooden meal. The fruits, excepting the oranges, were very indifferent, and he takes particular exception to the banana, which he had not tasted before. It was not at all to his liking. The water also was very bad, and the crew preferred what they had brought with them, though it was very stale. Monsieur de Bougainville reports that when he visited Rio he was at first received in a very friendly manner by the same Viceroy, but after a time the treatment was altered, and he had to put up with even greater insolence than Cook. The second death. When the stores had been received on board, the anchor was weighed in order to take up a more favourable position for making a start, but unfortunately, shortly after the ship got under way, a man named Peter Flowers fell from the main shrouds into the sea, and was drowned before assistance could be rendered. The second death since leaving England. The next day the wind was contrary, but everyone was so anxious to turn their backs on the place that Cook ordered out the boats to tow, but they were immediately brought up by a shot from the fort of Santa Cruz. A remonstrance was sent ashore, and receiving the lame excuse that the permit for leaving had been signed but had been delayed on its way, and the officer in command could not allow the vessel to leave till it was received. Another attempt to get away was soon after made, but the anchor fouled a rock, and there was again delay. At length, on the 7th of December, they were able to make a start, discharge their pilot, and bid farewell to the guard boat which had so constantly kept watch over them. They were informed that an Englishman named Foster, an officer in the Portuguese service, who had been of great use to them, was imprisoned for his kind attentions. On the 9th of December they met with bad weather and lost their foretop gallant mast, but the rough handling they got was credited with improving the sailing qualities of the ship, as it took some of the stiffness out of her upper works. A meteor was noted on the 23rd, like a small bright cloud, emitting flames, travelling rapidly westward, and disappearing slowly with 2 sharp explosions. The same day an eclipse of the sun was observed. Christmas Day for which the men had been saving up their allowances of grog, passed in the usual manner, that is, in considerable overindulgence. Banks speculates as to what might have happened if they had had bad weather, whilst Cook dismisses the occurrence very shortly. The people none of the soberest. On the 27th they crossed the mouth of the River Plate, the water being very discoloured, and a good many land insects were found in it. On the 2nd of January 1769 they saw some of the shoals of red lobsters like those mentioned by Dampier and Cowley, but they were not found in such quantities as those navigators reported. On the 11th the shores of Tierra de Fuego were sighted, and on working in closer, the country was found to be less desolate in appearance than they had expected from Anson's description. Arriving off the entrance to the Straits of Le Maire, between Staten Island and the mainland, they were driven back by the tide and a strong adverse wind, and trying to shelter under Cape Diego, they were carried past, and only after 3.5 days' hard work were they able to get through the straits. Cook has left sailing directions for this passage, which are followed to the present day. Banks and Solander were ashore for a short time on Staten Island, and returned delighted with the addition of some 100 new plants for their collection. Cook, with an eye to the welfare of his crew, remarks, "They returned on board, bringing with them several plants and flowers, etc., most of them unknown in Europe, and in that consisted their whole value." Cook and Green made a series of observations, the first ever made so far south in America, and fixed the position of Cape Diego at 66 degrees west, 54 degrees 39 south. Wharton places it at 65 degrees 8 minutes west, 54 degrees 40 minutes south. On the 15th they anchored in the Bay of Success for water and wood, and met with some of the inhabitants, with whom, by means of gifts of beads and other trifles, they established friendly relations, and 3 of them were persuaded to go on board the ship. Though by no means a small race of men, they were found to be nothing like the giants reported by the early navigators in this part of the world. They had in their possession buttons, glass, canvas, brown cloth, etc., showing conclusively that they had previously some communication with Europeans. Their clothing consisted chiefly of skins, roughly cured, and a plentiful covering of paint and dirt. The only personal property on which they appeared to set any store were their bows and arrows, which were carefully made and always in good order. Their food appeared to consist of seal and shellfish, their houses merely shelters of boughs covered with grass and leaves, built to windward of a small fire. A snowstorm. On the 16th of January, Banks, Solander, Buchan, Green, Monkhouse, 2 seamen, and Banks' 2 coloured servants tried to get up the hills to see something of the surrounding country, but they found their progress hampered by the dwarf vegetation. To add to their discomfort, a heavy snowstorm came on. Several of the party experienced that desire to sleep which is produced by cold, and were warned by Solander of the danger of giving way to it. Yet he was almost the first one to give in, and was with great difficulty kept awake. Buchan, most unfortunately, had a fit, so a large fire was made at the first convenient spot, but a sailor and the 2 coloured men lagged behind. During the night the sailor was heard shouting, and was brought in to the fire, but in the morning the 2 coloured men were found frozen to death. Cook attributed their death to overindulgence in spirits, the supply for the party being left in their charge. Not intending to remain away the night, supplies ran short, So a vulture was shot and carefully divided amongst them, each man cooking his own, which amounted to about 3 mouthfuls. At length the weather cleared up and a start back was made, and after 3 hours they struck the beach, only to find that they had never been in any great distance away, but had been describing a circle and came back almost to the same place whence they had started. Banks notes the vegetation as more exuberant than he expected, the dominant colour of the flowers white, and he collected wild celery and scurvy grass in large quantities, which was mixed with the food on board ship, as long as it could be preserved in a wholesome condition. Whilst at the Bay of Success the guns were lowered into the hold so as to allow more room on deck for working the ship in the bad weather they expected to encounter when rounding the Horn. The balance of the globe. On the 27th of January Cape Horn was passed, but owing to the fog and contrary wind they did not approach very closely, so they were unable to fix its exact position. But the description they were able to give of its appearance, there is a sketch of it by Mr. Pickersgill, master's mate, in the Records Office, and 24 observations taken in the immediate neighbourhood settled any doubts they may have had, and Cook puts it at 55 degrees 53 minutes south, 68 degrees 13 minutes west, and Wharton gives the corrected position as 55 degrees 58 minutes south, 67 degrees 16 minutes west. 3 days after, they reached their furthest south, according to Cook, 60 degrees 4 minutes south, 74 degrees 10 west, and the course was then altered to west by north. The continuous and careful observations of the state of the sea and the absence of currents during the following month caused Cook to come to the conclusion that the vast southern continent, so long supposed to exist somewhere in that part of the globe, and by some people esteemed necessary to preserve its balance, was non-existent. Banks expresses his pleasure in having upset this theory, and observes, "Until we know how the globe is fixed in its position, we need not be anxious about its balance." The weeks following the change of the course to the north were uneventful, only marked by an occasional success of the naturalists in obtaining a fresh specimen, some of which were experimented on by the cook. An albatross skinned, soaked all night in salt water, was stewed, served with savoury sauce, and was preferred to salt pork. A cuttlefish of large size, freshly killed by the birds, and too much damaged for classification, was made into soup, of which Banks says, "Only this I know, that of it was made one of the best soups I ever ate." The water obtained at Tierra del Fuego turned out very good, a great boon, as one of their great troubles and a source of great anxiety to Cook was the bad quality of the water so often obtained. Towards the end of March a change was noticed in the kinds of birds flying around the ship, some being recognised as ones that were known to stay near land, and consequently a sharp lookout was kept. On the night of the 24th a tree trunk was reported, but when morning came nothing further was seen. It has since been ascertained they were then a little to the north of Pitcairn Island, afterwards the home of the mutineers of the Bounty, but Cook did not feel himself at liberty to make any deviation from his course to look for what he was not sure to find, although he thought he was not far from those islands discovered by Quiros in 1606. On the 26th of March one of the marines committed suicide by drowning. It seems he had misappropriated a piece of sealskin, and his fellow soldiers, indignant that such a thing should have been done by one of the cloth, made his life uncomfortable, and threatened that he should be reported for theft. This was the 5th death since leaving England, and none by disease. The 4th of April at 10:30 a.m. Banks' servant, Peter Briscoe, sighted land, and the course of the ship was altered to give them a chance of inspecting it. It was found to be one of those peculiar circular reefs surrounded by a lagoon, called atolls, which exist in some quantity in the Pacific. There was no anchorage, so they made no attempt to land, but were able to see it was inhabited. Some 24 persons were counted through the glasses, and were described as copper-coloured, with black hair. They followed the ship as if preparing to oppose a landing. The reef was covered with trees, amongst which the coconut palm was conspicuous. Cook gave it the name of Lagoon Island. It is now known as Vahitahi, and is one of the Low Archipelago. Being now in Wallis's track, islands were sighted almost every day, and almost all appeared inhabited, but owing to the want of safe anchorage, no communication could be held with the natives. On the 10th of April, Osnaburg Island was passed, and the next day King George Land was sighted, but the wind failed, and they did not get close in until the 12th, when canoes came out to the ship, bringing branches of trees which were handed up the side, with signs directing they should be placed conspicuously in the rigging, as a token of friendship offered and accepted. When this had been done, the natives produced a good supply of trade in the shape of vegetables and fruit. Amongst the last, Banks enumerates breadfruit, bananas, coconuts and apples, a species of hog plum. These were very acceptable and beneficial to the crew after such a lapse of time without vegetable food, except the wild plants gathered in Tierra del Fuego. At Tahiti. At 7 a.m. on the 13th, they anchored in the bay described by Wallis, known as Matavai, in 13 fathoms, and Cook says of his route from Cape Horn, "I endeavoured to make a direct course, and in part succeeded." End of chapter 7.